listening to the Inside Nature podcast. I'm your host, Eric Olson, digital producer for Nature. Today is World Elephant Day, and we thought there was no better time to find out what's happening with Africa's elephants. The best person to answer this question, conservation biologist Mike Chase. Starting in 2014, Mike led the Great Elephant Census, a groundbreaking 2-year study that attempted to count all of Africa's savanna elephants. What he found was startling. Over the previous 7 years, elephant populations had declined by an astonishing 30%, mostly due to poaching. Mike spoke to us about the study from a remote research station in Botswana's Okavango Delta. To start, I'd just like to welcome you to the Inside Nature podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So, you've studied elephants for a long time, 15 years, I believe, or more than 15 years. And for our listeners, I just was wondering if you could give us a sense of how elephants are doing overall. Is there some yardstick that we can measure by to say how, African elephants as a species are doing overall?
Unfortunately, Eric, elephants are facing their bleakest moment in the last 100 years. This is a dark time in the natural history of elephant conservation. I've just finished flying an epic aerial survey called the Great Elephant Census, a seminal study that has attempted to estimate how many elephants are on the African continent. And the results from that study are really shocking. Over a 7-year period, it's estimated that 144,000 elephants have been killed, largely because of the ivory poaching crisis. And that number translates to about 30% of Africa's elephants.
So how many elephants do we think existed in Africa before, humans had settled there or human civilization had sort of taken over the continent?
Well, it's difficult to get reliable estimates, dating prehistory. But, in my estimation, the African continent would have been riddled with elephants in their tens of millions, possibly. We do know when Ian Douglas Hamilton conducted his elephant census, he estimated close on 1.2 million elephants in the 1970s. And our Great Elephant Census, nearly 40 years later, has estimated just under 400,000 elephants. So that is a catastrophic decline over a relatively short period.
And you're saying that even more recently that this decline has increased. Is that right?
It has indeed. Our mortality rates suggest that the elephant population is declining by 8% every year. For the first time in nearly 40 years, elephants are dying faster than they can recruit. So the death rates are higher than the birth rates.
Yeah, that's disturbing. Could you tell us a little bit more about the elephant census and how did you arrive at these numbers?
Well, the elephant census was flown across nearly 18 elephant range states. It involved nearly 100 scientists from across Africa, and it involved flying at low-level altitude in a fixed-wing plane mounted with high-resolution digital cameras and typically 3 observers, a data recorder, and every time an elephant herd was observed, it was counted, and as a way of verifying the observers' call-outs, photographs were also taken so we could subsequently go back and accurately estimate how many elephants were seen. So we used state-of-the-art technology and running complicated statistical analyses, we were able to come up with a really precise and accurate estimate on the numbers of African elephants left on the continent.
And how long did that take to, scan that much area? I mean, a year or longer?
It took us 2 years, and it was a daunting exercise. When I first announced the Great Elephant Census, there were a lot of naysayers, and people thought it would fail within the first year. But secretly, I didn't share their doubts. There was a lot at stake. This is an animal that's in peril, and armed with accurate and robust information, we hope that data would shock people out of apathy, and it certainly has. We've seen a huge transition in the last year. The public are certainly more aware. Governments have come on board. China has agreed to close down all its ivory factories, carving factories. So, there's genuine concern for the plight of the African elephant, but unfortunately, many of the populations are still threatened, if not by ivory poaching, by rapidly growing human populations. Elephants need space. This is the world's largest land mammal, weighing nearly 6 tons. And they have huge home ranges. They can embark on epic journeys. Our elephants in Botswana can move upwards of nearly 600 miles in a month. And unfortunately, land that used to belong to elephants has been converted to development, farming, and just human population pressures.
Right.
Half of the elephant range states' human population are projected to double in the next 50 years, meaning that many small, isolated elephant populations will probably become locally extinct.
Even if we were able to stop poaching completely, which, doesn't seem feasible right now, but, would this habitat encroachment, would that still be putting elephants at risk, or would they be at much less risk with the poaching? I mean, how big of a role does poaching play in the decline that we're seeing?
Well, you're absolutely right, Eric. Certainly, the ivory poaching crisis is exacerbating the rate of decline in African elephants. It's made worse by habitat fragmentation. Elephants need space, and Africa's human population is just growing at an increasingly rapid rate. It's the highest human population growth rates in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa. So, if we, by some miracle, happen to stop elephant poaching, elephants would still be endangered by habitat fragmentation. And that's the great tragedy of elephant conservation. They're just facing incalculable odds from climate change, poaching, habitat fragmentation, human-elephant conflict, drought, and increasingly being pushed into smaller islands in which to eke out a living.
You're saying this combination of all these human activities, it's just putting great pressure on them.
It is. I mean, there are some beacons of hope, and people have asked me after flying the Great Elephant Census if I'm an optimist or a pessimist about the future. And I'm a die-hard optimist. I have faith that elephant biologists and the public around the world are genuinely concerned about the plight of the elephant. And if I take my country, for example, Botswana, my home, we have a government, politicians who are extremely dedicated and committed to preserving African elephants and our wildlife, because we understand that ecotourism is a large foreign exchange earner and brings in hundreds of thousands of tourism visitors to our country every year. So, tourists are seeking out Botswana's wildlife, large elephant population, the largest in Africa, and wilderness areas, and we gaining from successful conservation practices.
That brings up an interesting point, which is, the Great Elephant Census found that overall elephants have declined, but you have a great map that was a result of this study, which we'll post on the website where this podcast is posted. But it does show that some countries seem to be doing better in terms of elephant conservation, and some areas you're even seeing an increase in elephants. Could you talk a little bit about that, and why is there this disparity between different countries?
You're right. I mean, that's the great irony of elephant conservation. They're doing well in some countries. We have healthy populations, and in others they are rapidly declining. And this can largely be attributed to the commitment and dedication of the governments, who are less corrupt, are determined to safeguard their wildlife population because of its importance to ecotourism. But we can't be complacent, Eric. Here in Botswana, And in southern Africa, what we're seeing is that the poaching pressure that was in West, Central, and East Africa is now filtering south. And we are seeing early warning signs of the poaching crisis possibly extending into southern Africa, into southeast Angola, southwest Zambia, parts of Namibia, and certainly parts of Botswana.
So are there things that governments are doing that are most effective to protect these elephants? And what are those things?
Well, I can only speak of my experience in Botswana, where the government have ensured that the Botswana Defence Force have been deployed to protect our wildlife along our international borders, and indeed well within the elephant heartland, the elephant range. So we have effective anti-poaching units. Our wildlife laws and arrests and prosecutions have all been reviewed and made increasingly more difficult and for people to commit these crimes. Wildlife trafficking is being given a lot of attention, and I can only speak of the case in Botswana, where we have very dedicated statesmen to protecting our wildlife heritage.
For our listeners, if they don't already know, elephant tusks, known as elephant ivory, is what's most valuable. I think it's currently, I know with rhino horn and some other wildlife products like that they're worth more than their weight in gold. Is that true for elephant tusks as well?
Yeah, arguably, this is the most precious and expensive organic material on the market after rhino horn is elephant ivory, elephant tusks, which are extensions of their, incisors, upper incisors, and can weigh, anything from a few pounds up to 100 pounds. And it's these large tuskers which poachers are typically identifying, and we've lost some really iconic, mammoth African elephants in the last 5 years to poachers who have sought them out specifically because they're carrying long, symmetrical ivory that reaches down to the ground. And unfortunately, contrary to popular belief in Asia, they think that, you can harvest these teeth without actually killing the elephant.
Wow.
But, all evidence to the contrary. Poachers leave African landscapes littered with rotting carcasses from elephants that they've killed to cut out these tusks.
Do we know what we can do to, curb the demand for this ivory?
Right. Well, we have campaigns around the world which have gained momentum. Documentary films, popular news articles, interviews like the one I'm giving you.
Right.
People in Africa giving voice to the plight of elephants is frightfully important. And, we've just got to carry on. We can't give up. We've got to let people know that these animals are really on a knife edge. And if we continue the rate that we are going, in 10 years' time, Africa will have less than 200,000 elephants. And certainly, many will be locally extinct in many parts of their ranges. And that the poaching crisis is extending. Poachers and wildlife traffickers find new hotspots throughout the continent in which to focus on. And currently, it appears that they are moving further down south.
So I think that's one thing that at least I wasn't aware of, that poachers are targeting specific areas, and are they basically wiping out populations in those areas entirely?
Yeah, they are, Eric. In many cases and areas that we flew over, I'm sad to say that we counted more dead elephants than live elephants, and that's a sign of that wasn't uncommon. There were days when I thought that the only good I was doing was recording the disappearance of one of the most remarkable animals that walks our planet.
Yeah.
And that was very depressing. And I thought that the Great Elephant Census, a project which when I started was filled with romance and anticipation and excitement about, possibly counting vast herds and numbers of elephants. It dawned upon me halfway through the Great Elephant Census that all I was doing as an elephant biologist was recording the annihilation and slaughter of one of the most charismatic animals that walks our planet.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean,
that
the
is
realization.
That is depressing. That's very depressing.
I mean, you know, any wildlife biologist or conservationist, you know, who comes to the realization that he's maybe fighting a losing battle.
Yeah.
That's a very daunting and difficult thing to get over. But, you know, we persevered, and I'm using the Great Elephant Census now, the power of incredible data, to drive and motivate for change. And we are seeing reduction in poaching in Tanzania, Kenya, Mozambique. The Great Elephant Census really motivated those governments to realize, wow, if we don't do something now and act very quickly, these elephants and these populations could disappear from our countries.
Right.
And these are symbols of Africa. You know, African elephants are emblematic of our struggle to save Africa's wildlife. And if we can't save the African elephant, you know, what is the future for the rest of Africa's wildlife?
Right. So your organization is called Elephants Without Borders. Could you tell us a little bit about it, and why is this concept of no borders so important?
Well, you know, elephants to me represent a massive liberty. I was fortunate during my PhD study to collar nearly 100 elephants, which embarked on epic journeys, many of them across international borders, passport-free. So this notion that elephants had the freedom of Africa, could wander across political boundaries, really